There is an unpleasant statistic that is on the rise. Divorce rates among adults over the age of 50 have increased from just 8% back in 1990 to over 36% as of 2019. And it's called gray divorce. For those getting close to retirement, a gray divorce can have a dramatic impact on each person's standard of living, not to mention their overall wealth. You're listening to Next Chapter Living, Planning Your Retirement Story. And here to dive into this sensitive yet relevant topic is our host, Steven Sabo. Steven is a financial advisor with Executive Financial Group. To learn more, visit executivefinancialgroup.com. Steven, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Alyssa. What is it? Today's St. Patrick's Day, correct?
It is.
That's
it
right.
is. And
we unfortunately do not have the luck of the Irish here in Western Pennsylvania. We have snow and we had a windstorm this past weekend. So
no fun. I said I've had a leprechaun in my studio this morning because things weren't working. So
yes.
You got the snowstorm in the wind, and I got faulty equipment. So
that's okay.
There you have it.
We're making it work.
We are indeed. Well, I know this is not the happiest of topics. You're newly married. So,
yes.
Ignore this. Plug your ears.
Yeah.
I'm happily married going on, how many years? My husband will listen, and I can't quote the number fast. It's a long time, but feels so fresh and new. That's the answer to that. But it's happening. We're seeing it. It's more common. People are waiting until maybe their kids leave the home to decide that they're ready to part directions, but it can have an impact on what retirement looks like, especially if it's a decision that's made 50s when you're closer to retirement.
Sure.
So let's dive in. What are some things that people who are facing this situation need to think about?
Yeah, like you said, it is kind of one of those unfortunate situations, and, it's a difficult conversation to have with clients, but it's one that is necessary because, there are so many things that can kind of affect a couple, both sides of the aisle with this. And so, a lot of the times it comes down to how are they going to look financially after this takes place. A lot of the times we have a situation where maybe the wife did not work outside of the home. And so, trying to navigate that as somebody, jumping back into maybe the working world with not a lot on their plate, I guess not a lot of, funds or experience in the last, say, 20 years, that can be very difficult. And, often there's a lot of situations that are just, having to split up 401ks or things like that are difficult for everybody. And, it's complex. It's unfortunate and, it's tough to navigate, but there are a lot of things, as far as, like you said, kind of splitting up the funds, maybe the family home. And so it becomes a difficult situation on, maybe somebody's been in that house for the last 20 years and they have an attachment to it and they don't want to get rid of it. But unfortunately for one person, it's going to be more difficult to, kind of keep up with the finances of the house, the expenses and everything like that. And so, a lot of the times we're starting back at ground zero with clients and saying, hey, look, we kind of have to rework this whole situation. We're going to start from scratch here and redo this whole thing to make sure that we can and, rework numbers and maybe when is the right time now at this point to retire and how are we going to fill these budget deficits? And, so there's a lot that goes into it that, I think that not that people don't think about it, but, doesn't really dawn on them until they're already in it.
You're
and they're like, okay, yeah. So.
Well, you mentioned that women often feel the impact, and there was a study done by USA Today that said women on average see a decline in their standard of living that's close to 45% as opposed to the average man sees a decline in their standard of living of just 20%. And I say just 20% is still significant for, the gentleman in those situations, but a 45% decline, that's a very drastic difference in a standard of living when you're taking into consideration factors like inflation that we have zero control over. And now we've lost nearly half of our purchasing power for what we are used to living on the side of the female. Talk to me a little bit about, I guess, some of the practicalities of what it looks like. We mentioned having to deal with retirement accounts. Certainly,
Yeah.
there's the emotional factor of divorce, and that's a conversation in and of itself. And we'll leave that for the therapist side
Sure. Yeah.
of
Right.
things. But there's some practicality. What does that look like in terms of what does it do to taxes and some
Yeah.
of these other things that will come into play when you're dividing assets?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of it, and unfortunately, we're dealing with this situation right now. We have a couple who are dealing with this, and they had to. He had an old 401k that we helped them roll over, and so in their divorce proceedings, they had a settlement. She was going to be receiving some of that 401k rollover, and so we had to do what was called a quadro, which is just a qualified domestic relations order, which is something that is done by the court system, and they decide, what happens. But that is like in a 401k, obviously, if you just took the money out and did that, then well, you're going to be faced with taxes and penalties and things like that. And so you need to be sure that you are doing certain things correctly in order to avoid some of that. And like I said, the quadro is what we call it, the QDRO. That's how we say it, but the qualified domestic relations order. And so, that allows you to split those taxable assets without penalties. They kind of came up with something through the IRS and everything like that to allow you to be able to split those types of accounts, because if not, if you didn't do it that way, you really could be faced with a huge tax bill at the end of the day. And so you have to make sure that you're doing that correctly and that you're sending that through the right channels to, make it so that, nobody is stuck with a big, huge tax bill. And then, obviously there are changes to what's going to happen as far as the taxes go, as far as your income goes, all of those different things. There's a lot that kind of goes into it. And it's just one of those things that it's difficult enough for the couple to deal with to begin with. So, making sure that we have all these things kind of buttoned up for the clients to make sure that we get everything correct for them, because, at the end of the day, they have, typically you're going to see somebody that is now working again that, may not have been for a while, and maybe they aren't making as much money as they were hoping to make. And so, every little dollar counts in the end of it. It's something that we really need to be making sure that we're handling.
We mentioned earlier, the discrepancy in what women especially can expect to make or how their lifestyle is affected. When in this process is it ideal for a man or a woman to sit down with an advisor and start to put proactive plans in place, taking into consideration, we'll look at the female side for a minute, things like alimony that may be there for a little while but aren't long term. How can they factor that in? And when should they start having that conversation with an advisor to make sure, to your point, they're taking advantage of every dollar that's coming in so that they can adjust to this new lifestyle?
Yeah, I mean, we think it's important to have that conversation as soon as possible. I know that you may not want to have these conversations. They are difficult, but
and certainly it's hard to have it with your soon-to-be ex. Chances are they're not wanting to have quality conversations if you reach that point.
That's tough to navigate, but, we think that it is important to, like in the situation that we had, luckily, they were still cordial enough with each other so that it was one of those things where I think they just wanted it behind both of them.
Sure.
And so they wanted to figure it out. And, obviously we stayed out of the negotiations on who was getting what and how it was being done. We were just here to help facilitate. We want to have those conversations as quickly as possible because for her, things are going to change dramatically. And then same for him, so we had to have that conversation. Well, here's, part of this account is going to her. And so here's how it's going to affect you. And then on her end, we kind of had a plan in place for when you wanted to retire and how that was going to look. But now, like you said, without having your spouse with you, that's going to change things, right? You had your accounts, he had his accounts, and combined, they were one thing. And whenever you split them, it becomes something totally different. And so for her, we said, hey, look, here's how we're going to have to do things. And I know you wanted to retire by this certain age, and we'd like for that to still be a reality, but we have to kind of rework the plan that we had in place. And we need to take a look at it from the ground up and say, okay, here's what you're going to be eligible for Social Security, starting all over again, the things that we did whenever we first met them and came up with our plan and saying, here's what you got from this, here's what you'll have from work and the accounts that you have. Here's how we can generate money from this. But, at this point, you're dealing with a lesser amount of money. And so we want to make sure that you are still going to be okay to live comfortably through retirement, so we had to look at her budget and go back over the Social Security options again. And unfortunately for her, it was a situation where, we said, you might have to go a few more years working, even though you have received some assistance and everything like that. But, for her, it just wasn't going to be quite enough. And so, we had to say, hey, look, unfortunately, we're going to have to push this back a few years. It doesn't mean it's never going to happen. But, we just need to take a look at some of these things and just make sure that you're going to be in a position that where if we tell you that you can retire, that you're going to be able to sustain that throughout your lifetime. And it can be difficult for the client to hear sometimes, but, I think it's important to make sure that they do know that, because I think that if you're letting your client believe that everything is going to be the same, then, I think you're not doing a right job for them.
Well, I think societally, too, we sort of have this disservice because we see divorces, high-profile divorces like Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban. And, they're obviously millionaires in their own right. So when they separate, their lifestyle is certainly not affected from our perspective as the outside looking in. Jennifer Lopez, Ben Affleck, you see these, again, high profile celebrities, and they sort of normalize that life just goes on. But there was a study done by Alliance Life that said 56% of Americans say that a divorce would completely derail their retirement strategy. So I want to end it on a happier note because, this topic is hard to hear. We know that money conversations can often be one of the biggest causes of divorce.
Yes.
What are some conversations that some couples that maybe aren't seeing eye to eye financially, where's a good place to start so that perhaps they can work it out before it ever gets to this point?
Yeah, it's so hard. Everybody's so different and all the situations are different whenever it comes to this. But, I think just having the conversations with these clients about, kind of where you are and prior to these things taking place, right? If we sit down and we're meeting with clients, say annually or whatever, and it's one of those things where we're talking about credit card bills or things like that, you really just have to make sure that they understand that, hey, look, this is bad enough now for the situation that we're dealing with. So if this continues and, if something else were to happen, AKA this divorce, something like that, it could be really bad. And so we are always trying to get clients on the same page and to try and, understand their situation and just kind of where things are and get them, talking to each other about these things, as difficult as that is. And like you said, hey, I'm not here for the therapy side of things. I think there's much more qualified people, but we do see these conversations sometimes as a form of therapy, right? They come in and, you can kind of tell when you touch on something that is a little bit sensitive in the relationship. And so again, it's not necessarily my place to jump in and, try and work this out between them, but it is important to bring these things up so that maybe we can get them on the same page with things. Maybe they don't want to work it out on their own, but sometimes in front of their financial advisor, maybe the light bulb clicks and they say, you know what, okay, yeah, we've been struggling on talking about this, or we don't like to talk about that. And I say, hey, look, I'm not here to get into your personal lives or anything like that. But at the end of the day, the more that I know and the more that I can help you with these things, the better the plan is going to be for everybody.
And you at least have the blessing of being an unemotional, unbiased third party. You're looking at just the numbers, and math doesn't lie. It's factual, and you're able to see the facts, not the emotions or the stories that are behind some of those things.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it is always kind of an emotional process, no matter what you're talking about here with finances. And so, we're laying it out and saying, hey, look, put all that stuff aside.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, here are the facts, here are the numbers, here's kind of how it's going to break down. And so if we can get a handle on this now, then it's going to be much better for everybody in the long run, no matter what happens, no matter what takes place. And so we try and do our best to kind of just lay that out for the clients and make sure that they understand that, hey, even if you're not dealing with the situation now, it needs to be dealt with. And so kind of start thinking about it and coming up with a plan and talk to each other.
Well, if you're facing a new or unexpected chapter in your story, you can schedule a complimentary consultation with Steven today by visiting executivefinancialgroup.com, or you can give a call at 724-283-2806. You can also find them on YouTube and Facebook. And of course, be sure to subscribe wherever you're currently listening so that you never miss an episode. We promise not all of them are going to be this, heavy and depressing. We'll find some fun things to talk about too. But it's relevant. And for those that are going through it, certainly nice to know that they're not alone and that they have someone that they can turn to. So, Steven, we appreciate you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alyssa. We appreciate it. And just to close out on that, like you said, it is, it's something as much as nobody likes to talk about it, it is important to talk about these things. And we think that it, at the end of the day, it makes for a much better relationship for everybody. Like you said, we'll be back on some of the better topics here soon, but this is definitely an important one. So thank you.
Well, we appreciate you joining us. And again, that website is executivefinancialgroup.com.
The opinions expressed by Steven Sabo and guests on this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of this podcast station. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Past performance cannot be used as an indicator to determine future results. Any strategies mentioned may not be suitable for everyone. Information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for you. Before acting on any information mentioned, please consult with a qualified tax or investment advisor to determine if it is suitable for your specific situation. This program is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information with regard to subject covered. Investment advisory services offered through Virtue Capital Management, LLC, VCM, a registered investment advisor. VCM and Executive Financial Group are independent of each other. Pennsylvania Insurance License number 670429. Any guarantees mentioned are backed by the financial strength and claims paying ability of the issuing insurance company and may be subject to caps, restrictions, fees, and surrender charges as described in the annuity contract. Steven Sabo and/or Executive Financial Group are not affiliated with or endorsed by the Social Security Administration or any other government agency.